my retirement party, my daughter-in-law stood up in front of 60 guests and announced that I should sign my house over to her and my son because, and I remember her exact words, "Dad's getting older. And frankly, a man living alone in a 4-bedroom home in Oakville is just wasteful." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. When I said no, she leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume and whispered something that made my chest go cold. So I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and made 2 calls. 40 minutes later, 2 people walked through the door of that banquet hall, and my daughter-in-law's face went the color of the tablecloths. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My son called me on a Tuesday evening in late September, which was unusual. He normally texted. I'd just come in from the garage where I'd been doing what I always do after dinner, pretending to organize my woodworking tools while actually just listening to the Leafs game on the old radio I've had since before he was born. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad." His voice had that particular pitch I recognized from when he was 17 and had dented the car. High energy, slightly breathless, bracing for impact. "I need to tell you something big." I sat down on my workbench. "Go ahead." "Vivienne and I are engaged." I set the rag down very carefully on the pegboard beside the chisels. "Vivienne." 3 months. They had known each other for exactly 3 months because I remembered meeting her for the first time at my son's birthday dinner in late June. A dinner she had arrived 40 minutes late to without apology, spent most of scanning my son's apartment like she was doing a home assessment, and left early citing a work commitment that she mentioned with a smile I couldn't quite place. "That's wonderful news," I said. I kept my voice level. "My son is 31 years old, a civil engineer with a good head on his shoulders, and he had sounded that happy exactly twice in recent memory. Once when the Raptors won the championship and once when he got his PN examination. I wasn't going to take that from him over the phone. She said yes right there at the restaurant. I got down on one knee and everything, Dad." She cried. "Where did you go?" "That Italian place on Lakeshore. Osteria something. She loves it there." I knew the place. $40 for pasta. "Congratulations, son. When can I meet her properly? Have her over for dinner?" He hesitated just a fraction of a second. "Yeah, absolutely. Soon. She's excited to get to know you better." After we hung up, I sat in the garage for a long time without turning the radio back on. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. 34 years as a structural engineer teaches you to assess load-bearing capacity before you commit to a design, not after. What I'd seen of Vivienne in those few hours at the birthday dinner hadn't alarmed me outright. But it had registered. The way she'd asked my son, in front of me, how his pension contributions were going. The way she'd glanced at the framed photo of our family cottage on his wall and asked if it was his. The way she'd looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, like she was doing long division. My late wife Eleanor would have known what to do. She always did. She had this gift for disarming people, for creating situations where the truth surfaced naturally without anyone feeling cornered. She passed 4 years ago, ovarian cancer, and the house in Oakville has been very quiet since. My son checks on me Sundays, rewatch whatever game is on, and I make too much food and he takes the leftovers home in containers I never get back. It's a good arrangement. I didn't want anything to disturb it, which is precisely why I was worried. The dinner took 3 weeks to arrange. My son kept saying soon, and I kept not pushing, and eventually I called him directly and said I was making a roast on Saturday 7 o'clock, and they were both welcome. He checked with Vivienne. She said yes. I spent Saturday cleaning the house with the particular thoroughness I reserve for situations that matter. Eleanor's good dishes came down from the cabinet. I made a standing rib roast with roasted root vegetables and a wild rice pilaf, the kind of meal my mother used to make for company in Nova Scotia. A Niagara Cabernet from the wine rack. The house smelled like Sunday afternoons from my childhood. They arrived 7 minutes early. My son came through the door like he always does, shrugging off his coat mid-step, already talking. Vivienne came in behind him, and I watched her eyes move across the front hallway. The wainscoting, the hardwood floors, the original casings around the door frames, before they settled on me. "This is so charming," she said. "Old houses have such personality." "Thank you," I said. "Built in 1987. Come in." The living room assessment took about 90 seconds. She touched the arm of Eleanor's reading chair, examined the painting above the mantel, which Eleanor had bought from a local artist at a market in Kingston, and asked me point blank what the square footage was. My son looked mildly embarrassed. I told her and offered wine. At dinner, she found something to criticize about everything and managed to make it sound like a compliment each time. The roast was so homey in a retro kind of way. The wild rice was ambitious. The wine was interesting, not really what I'm used to, but local is local, right? At one point, she picked up Eleanor's china and turned the plate over to check the mark on the bottom, which I found remarkable. When I mentioned Eleanor, briefly, in the context of explaining where I'd learned the recipe, Vivian put her fork down and said, "It must be hard rattling around in this big house by yourself." My parents sold their place in Mississauga the minute my brother and I left home. They said it was liberating. My son put his hand on her arm. "Different strokes," he said quietly. "Oh, I just mean a property this size in Oakville must be worth quite a bit now. It seems like a lot to manage alone." "I manage fine," I said. She smiled at me over her wine glass. "Of course you do." They left at 9:30. My son hugged me at the door and said everything was delicious. Vivian said it had been educational. I stood at the window until their taillights disappeared around the bend in the road. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. It wasn't the China thing. It wasn't the square footage question. Individually, each moment was dismissible. Cumulatively, they formed a pattern I recognized because I had seen it once before, in my own life, 35 years ago, in a woman I was briefly engaged to at 26 who had viewed my engineering degree primarily as a financial instrument. That relationship lasted 8 months, long enough to teach me that a certain kind of person can look at you and see only inventory. What decided me was finding Vivian's phone. She'd left it wedged between the seat cushion and the arm of Eleanor's chair. I found it when I was clearing the living room after they left. The screen was off. I picked it up to set it on the table and my thumb brushed the edge and it lit up with a waiting notification. The name on the screen was Bastian. The preview read, "Missing you already. How is the obligation?" Obligation. I set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then I heard gravel in the driveway. They'd realized it was missing. I moved the phone to the front hall table and had my expression under control by the time my son knocked. Vivian came in past him with the specific urgency of someone afraid of what might have been seen. Picked it up, checked it up, checked it. I watched her check it and gave me a smile that was mostly relief. "Always forgetting the thing," she said. "Easy to do," I said. After they left the second time, I went back to the kitchen table and I started writing things down. I'm an engineer. I build structures designed to hold weight for 100 years. You do not pour a foundation without testing the soil first. What I'd seen on that phone screen was a data point, and a data point is not a conclusion. But it was enough to justify soil testing. The next morning I drove down to the coffee shop on Kerr Street, where I go most weekday mornings, ordered my usual dark roast, and opened a fresh notebook. I had been retired for 3 years and had never once missed working. That morning, for the first time since my last day on the job, I felt purposeful in a way I hadn't expected. Her workplace first. Vivian managed a wellness studio on Brant Street, the kind of place that sells $120 yoga mats and has a chalkboard menu of teas by the door. I drove by it once at 9 in the morning and established her schedule from there. She opened Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 6. Sundays she apparently spent with my son. Mondays were interesting. The first Monday, I drove past the studio at noon. It was closed, which was normal. But Vivian's car was parked 2 blocks east on a residential street, and as I watched from the coffee shop across the way, a man came out of the building's main entrance and held the door for her. Mid-30s. Tall. She kissed him in a way that is not how you greet a colleague. I took 3 photographs with my phone from across the street. The second Monday was the same. Different restaurant, same man. I was close enough this time, at a table near the window of the pasta place on the next block, to see him hand her a small gift bag. She opened it at the table. Earrings, from the look of it. She put them on immediately. By the third week, I had a name. He'd used a credit card at the counter of the coffee shop where they'd met the previous Tuesday, and I'd heard the barista read it back. Bastian Kowalczyk. I wrote it in the notebook. Age, approximately 36. Vehicle, a gray Audi registered to an address in Burlington. He worked in commercial real estate. He had a public LinkedIn profile, and his relationship status on Facebook was listed as in a relationship, accompanied by a photo of himself and Vivian at what appeared to be Niagara-on-the-Lake sometime in the summer. My son and Vivian had started dating in June. This photograph was dated July. I kept going. The pattern was consistent. Bastian on Mondays and Wednesday evenings. My son on Sundays and most Fridays. The days between were loosely distributed, but she was not a woman who spent many evenings alone. There was a third person. A woman named, I eventually gathered from a conversation I overheard at the studio door, Renee, who collected Vivian on 2 Saturday nights after closing, once from the studio and once from a wine bar on Rebecca Street in Oakville. I could not determine the nature of that relationship with certainty and chose not to speculate. What I could document with certainty was this. Bastian Kowalczyk believed he was in a committed relationship with the woman my son was preparing to marry. He had given her jewelry. He had spent a weekend with her in wine country. He did not appear to know my son existed. By the time I had 40 photographs and 5 weeks of handwritten observations, my son called to tell me the date, March 8th. A Saturday. They'd booked a venue in Burlington, 40 minutes from my house. A restored mill on the Grindstone Creek, the kind of place that costs $8,000 to rent before catering. He sounded the happiest I'd heard him in years. That night I sat in Eleanor's chair, the same one where Vivian had left her phone, and I opened the photo album from the side table. Eleanor and I at our own wedding, 1989, St. Andrews in Burlington. My son at 3 years old, sitting on her lap at Christmas. My father, who had taught me that you do not build anything on a foundation you haven't tested. I held the album and thought about the kind of damage I was about to cause, and whether the alternative was worse. There was no version of this where nobody got hurt. The question was whether the pain happened now or 2 years from now, after a mortgage was shared and joint accounts were open and the legal and financial untangling had begun. I had watched that happen to a colleague whose son went through a divorce at 34. It took 3 years and cost more than the house. I decided to wait until the day itself. Not from cruelty, from strategy. I needed Bastian in a room where my son could see his face, and I needed witnesses, and I needed Vivian to have no time to construct a counter-narrative. A private conversation 3 days before would give her 72 hours to prepare. An envelope slid under my son's door the night before would give him 12 hours to spiral alone. The wedding was a controlled environment. 60 guests, a fixed location, no exits until I was ready. I composed the message to Bastian 2 weeks in advance and saved it as a draft. It was simple. I told him there had been an incident involving Vivienne at the reception venue on the creek in Burlington, that she had asked for him specifically, and that he should come as soon as he could. I included the address and the approximate time. I did not sign it with my name. My retirement party was the cover. This had been my son's idea, actually, to combine the wedding reception with a small celebration of my 34-year career, a gesture I found genuinely touching and which I'd been looking forward to for reasons that had nothing to do with what I was planning. 60 people in the banquet room of the mill venue, my former colleagues from the engineering firm, my son's friends, cousins from Halifax, Eleanor's sister who flew in from Victoria. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon. Small, immediate family and close friends only in the venue's garden overlooking the creek. It was a cold day, the first week of March, but clear, the kind of Canadian winter afternoon that's almost beautiful as long as you're dressed for it. My son looked at Vivian the way he had looked at very few things in his life. I stood in the front row and held it together because falling apart was not useful. At the reception, the masks came off within the first 30 minutes. I was standing near the bar with 2 of my former colleagues when Vivian appeared at my elbow with the particular purposefulness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. She touched my arm and steered me gently toward the side of the room, near the windows that looked out over the frozen creek. "I'd been wanting to talk to you," she said. Her voice was warm, conversational, as if we were about to discuss the weather. "About the house. Is that right? You know, my son and I are going to need space now that we're married. A young couple needs room to grow. That Oakville property, honestly, it's too big for one person. We've looked at the numbers." She folded her hands together. "We think the right thing would be for you to transfer it to us. You could find something smaller, something easier to manage. A condo, maybe. There are lovely ones in downtown Oakville." I looked at her for a moment. The confidence in her face was remarkable. Not a trace of uncertainty. She genuinely believed she had read the situation correctly. "No," I said. The warmth evaporated. "I'm sorry." I said no. "That house has been my home for 32 years. I raised my son there. My wife died there. I'm not transferring it to anyone." She stepped closer. Her voice dropped, but the edge in it sharpened. "You're being selfish. Property like that is an asset that should be working for a family, not sitting empty while you putter around with your woodworking. I'd like to rejoin my guests. We can do this the easy way, or—" I never heard the rest of it because her hand came up and across my face before I registered the motion. The sound was sharp. Several heads turned. Vivian's expression, for one instant, showed pure shock at her own action. Then it closed again, and she straightened. My son materialized from across the room. "What just happened?" He looked between us. "Vivienne, did you?" He's being completely unreasonable about. I took my phone from my jacket pocket. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I found the draft message, looked at my son, and said, "I need you to watch the door." Then I sent it. The second message, to a number I'd obtained through what I will describe only as patient inquiry, went to Bastian Kowalczyk 1 minute later. "What are you doing?" Vivian's voice had shifted register entirely. The social fluency was gone. "Who are you calling?" "I'm not calling anyone," I said. "I'm sending a message. 2, actually. They'll be here in about 40 minutes. The reception continued around us in that particular way that gatherings do when something is clearly wrong, but no one has confirmed it yet. My former colleagues drifted to the edges of conversations. The DJ, reading the room, brought the music down slightly. My son stood very still beside me, watching his new wife's face run through expressions I suspected he had never seen there before. At 4:53, the main doors at the back of the banquet hall opened. Bastian Kowalczyk walked in, still wearing his coat, looking around with the specific expression of a man who expects to find someone injured and does not. He was tall, better looking than his LinkedIn photo, and he spotted Vivian in her wedding dress from across the room and stopped as if he had walked into a wall. He stood there for what felt like a full minute. Then, "Vivian?" She had gone completely still. "Why are you in a wedding dress?" My son turned to look at his wife. He turned back to the man at the door. He is not a slow man, my son. He had it inside of 10 seconds. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. Who are you? What is happening?" I walked toward them with the folder I had been carrying inside my jacket since that morning. It was slim. I hadn't brought everything, just the essentials. The photographs from Niagara on the Lake with a date stamp visible. The 3 photographs from the Burlington Mondays. The one that showed Bastian putting on her coat outside the wine bar on Rebecca Street, his hand resting on her back, with the easy familiarity of someone who has done that 1,000 times. I laid them on the nearest table. "My name is Lawrence Aldridge," I said. "I'm the groom's father. I spent 5 weeks documenting what you're looking at. I believe the two of you have something to discuss." Bastian picked up the photograph from Niagara. He set it down. He picked up the one from the restaurant. He looked at Vivian with an expression that had moved past confusion into something quieter and more final. "We were supposed to." He stopped. Looked at the wedding dress again. Looked at my son. "How long?" She said nothing. "How long, Vivienne?" "Bastian, don't." He set the photographs down with the careful movements of someone managing great feeling in a public place. He looked at my son. I'm sorry. I had no idea you existed. I want you to know that." My son nodded once. It was a small nod. Bastian picked up his coat from where it had fallen off his arm without his noticing, and he walked back through the banquet hall doors without looking at Vivienne again. The room was very quiet, 60 people not moving. My son stood in front of his wife. He looked at the photographs. He looked at her. She was already preparing the speech. I could see it in her posture, the way she'd straightened, the way her chin had come up. "Paul always talks about what a paranoid old man you are," she said. It was directed at me, but she watched my son when she said it. "This is exactly what I told you he'd do. He can't stand to see you happy. He's been sabotaging us since the beginning." "You left your phone at my house," I said, "the night of that dinner. I didn't read anything." The preview was visible when the screen lit up. A message from Bastian calling the dinner an obligation. I looked at my son. "I am sorry. I truly did not want to be right." My son put his hands in his pockets. He stood there for a moment looking at the photographs on the table. Then he looked up at the guests, his aunts and cousins and colleagues and friends, and he straightened his tie. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he said. "I'm sorry that the reception won't be continuing." He paused. "The caterer has been paid. Please eat before you go." A few people laughed. The small, surprised kind that comes from the intersection of grief and absurdity. Vivienne tried twice more. Once when my son began speaking quietly to Eleanor's sister, and once when he went to get his coat. Both times he walked away with the patient deliberateness of a man who has decided to spend his energy on things that deserve it. She found me at the bar, the second time, her voice dropping to the register she'd used when she asked me about the house. "You've destroyed his life," she said. "You know that." "I've preserved it," I said. "He'll understand the difference eventually." She left before most of the guests did. I watched her collect her bag from the bridal suite and walk through the mill's main doors without looking back, her coat thrown over the wedding dress, heels on the flagstone, and then the sound of her car on the gravel lot, and then nothing. My son found me an hour later, sitting on a bench near the creek, the cold coming up off the ice in a way that made you feel like the world was clean. He sat down beside me. Neither of us said anything for a long time. The sun was dropping behind the tree line on the far bank, the light going orange and thin the way it does in Ontario in early March. "I remember," he said finally, "you telling me once that the most important part of structural design is knowing what you're building on." "Your grandfather told me that," I said, "before I ever drafted a single plan." He was out at the creek. "How long did you know?" "I suspected the night she came for dinner. I found out the night she left her phone. I started gathering evidence the next morning." He was quiet for a while. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you would have told her I knew, and then you would have had a conversation with her instead of evidence. And she would have explained everything in a way that made me the problem." He thought about that. I watched his profile in the fading light. He looks like Eleanor around the eyes, and I waited. "I can't believe I didn't see it," he said. "You were in love. Love doesn't make you stupid. It just narrows your field of vision. Every person who has ever loved another person has had that narrowing. Even you? Especially me." He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the ice. "There's going to be a lot to sort out. The marriage certificate, the venue deposit. I don't even know if... we haven't done anything, filed anything. I need to talk to someone. A lawyer, probably. You don't need a full divorce proceeding if the marriage was entered fraudulently," I said. "In Ontario, there may be grounds for annulment depending on the circumstances. But yes, talk to a lawyer Monday morning. I'll go with you if you want." He looked at me. "You already looked this up?" "Last week." He laughed. It was short, and it had tears in it. "But it was real?" "Of course you did." We sat there until the cold made it impractical, and walked back inside to say goodbye to the guests who were still finishing the food my son had insisted they eat. Eleanor's sister hugged him for a long time. His friends from the firm stood close and didn't say much, and that was exactly right. Someone had gathered the photographs from the table and left them in a neat stack at the bar. I put them in my jacket pocket without looking at them. On the drive home, my son followed my headlights all the way up the QEW to Oakville, the way he used to as a teenager when we came home late from games. I noticed in the rear view mirror when he turned off toward his apartment, and I sat in my driveway for a moment after pulling in, the engine ticking, the house dark except for the light I always leave on in the front hallway. I went inside, hung up my coat, and put the kettle on. There are things a father carries. You carry them not because they are easy, but because there is no one else to carry them, and because the weight of them is nothing compared to what your child would carry if you set them down. Eleanor understood that better than anyone I ever knew. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and the folder and a pen, and I wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Done." Then I closed the notebook and left it on the table. My son called at 11:30 that night from his apartment. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "and I'm sorry I didn't listen better the first time." "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "You were doing what people in love do. I would have done the same." Still, I agreed. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, the Leafs' upcoming road trip, whether I needed anything from Costco, a documentary he'd started watching, normal things, the ordinary fabric of a life that was still intact. After we said goodnight, I washed my cup and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment at the hallway mirror, the same mirror that had been there since Eleanor and I moved in, the one she used to check her earrings in before we went out. An old man in a good suit, a little tired, a line across his cheek from the cold. I turned off the hallway light. The house was quiet, and the quiet felt like the right kind. I still think about that bench by the creek sometimes. The ice on the grindstone, the light going thin and orange behind the trees, my son sitting beside me without saying anything for a long time. There are moments in a life that don't announce themselves as important until you're already inside them, and that was one of them. What Vivienne did was calculated. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to frame the whole thing as a love story gone wrong, a young woman who made bad choices under pressure. But what I documented over those 5 weeks wasn't impulsive or confused. It was organized. She had assigned days. She managed 3 people the way you manage a schedule, and she did it with enough discipline that none of us knew the others existed. That kind of deception doesn't happen by accident. It comes from a belief, held quietly and consistently, that other people exist primarily as resources. I've known a few people like that in my life. Not many, but enough to recognize the pattern. The thing they have in common isn't cruelty exactly. It's the absence of a certain kind of accountability. They don't ask themselves whether what they're doing is right. They ask whether they can get away with it. And for a while, often a long while, the answer is yes. What stopped it in my son's case wasn't luck. It was patience. I had to sit with what I knew and not act on it before the moment was right. That was harder than the surveillance. Every Sunday when my son came over and talked about the wedding plans, every time he mentioned Vivienne's name with that particular warmth in his voice, I had to hold the information I was carrying and trust that the right time would come. Engineers call it load management. You don't pour everything into a structure at once. You sequence the stress deliberately, or the whole thing fails. My father used to say that good judgment is just experience you've had the sense to learn from. I was engaged once, briefly, to a woman who saw my engineering degree as a financial instrument rather than the result of 10 years of work and sacrifice. That relationship ended before it caused permanent damage, but only barely. The lesson I took from it, that some people view intimacy as a transaction, sat in me for 35 years before it became useful again. Nothing is wasted, not even the painful things, especially not those. What I want my son to carry forward isn't bitterness. Bitterness is what happens when you let someone else's dishonesty become your permanent weather. What I want him to carry is discernment, the willingness to look clearly at what's in front of him even when clarity is inconvenient. That takes a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like stubbornness. It looks like a father who won't stop asking uncomfortable questions. Sometimes it looks for a while like the enemy of happiness. It isn't. It's the foundation that happiness requires. The house in Oakville is still mine. The notebook is in the kitchen drawer. My son calls on Sundays and we watch whatever game is on, and I make too much food, and he takes the leftovers home. Some things hold. If you build them right, they hold.